video. Today we're going to talk about World War One, but before we get into that, um, I just hit my 1 year mark at my job, got my first raise already, which is not bad. Also, next week I start college, and also this Saturday coming up, which is the 11th, or no, actually 12th, I go on vacation from my job, so I won't be there for 8 days. Um, I'm going to try to hit up the city because there's a lot of interesting stuff in the land of Chicago to see for like tourism stuff like that. Like you got the museums, the zoos, Lake Michigan, Navy Pier, that stuff to go see before wintertime hits. Um, so also before we get into the World War One video, I do want to put this out. I've been diehardly listening to this channel called Coffin Crown, which is an actual band, which is two brothers. They basically do dark country music or Americana called or Southern Gothic. They got like a bluesy tone to the music and with a little rock and country in there, and they're not bad. So I suggest you can check them out if you like music like that. So now let's get into it. World War One. The World War One was fought between July 28th of 1914 and it ended on November 11th of 1918. Um, and it was also known as the Great War. And it was a global conflict between two coalitions. The Allies are Entente and the Central Powers. Main areas of conflict included Europe and the Middle East, as well as parts of Africa and the Asia Pacific. There were important developments in weaponry, including tanks, aircraft, artillery, machine guns, and chemical weapons. Now, this was considered to be one of the deadliest conflicts in history, and it resulted in an estimated 30 million military casualties, plus another 8 million civilian deaths from war-related causes and genocide. Now, the movement of large numbers of people was a major factor in the deadly Spanish flu pandemic, because that's also when the Spanish flu also came about. Um, excuse me. Um, Now, the causes of the World War One included the rise of Germany and the decline of the Ottoman Empire, which disturbed the long-standing balance of power in Europe, imperial rivalries and shifting alliances, and an arms race between the great powers. Now, now growing tensions between the great powers and in the Balkans reached the breaking point on June 28th of 1914, um, when um, when Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serbian, assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Now, Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia, and they declared war on July 28th after Russia mobilized in Serbia's defense. Germany declared war on Russia and France, who had an alliance. Now, the United Kingdom entered after Germany invaded Belgium, and the Ottomans joined the Central Powers in November. Now, Germany's strategy in 1914 was to quickly defeat France, then transfer its forces um, to the um, to the east, but its advances was halted in September of that year. And by the end of the year, the Western Front consisted of a near continuous line of trenches from the English Channel to Switzerland, and the Eastern Front was more dynamic, but neither side gained a decisive advantage despite costly offensives. Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, and others entered the war from 1915 onward. Now, major battles, including those at Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele, they failed to break the stalemate on the Western Front. Um, Now we got a troll on this channel here. Failed to break the stalemate on the Western Front. In April 1917, the United States joined the Allies after Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare against Atlantic shipping. Now, later that year, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. In the October Revolution, Soviet Russia signed an armistice with the Central Powers in December, which was followed by a separate peace in March of 1918. Now that month, Germany launched a spring offensive in the West, which, despite initial success, it left the German army exhausted and demoralized. Now, the Allied Hundred Days Offensive. Bulgaria signed an armistice in late September. By early November, the Ottoman Empire and the Austria-Hungary had each signed armistice with the Allies, leaving Germany isolated, and they were facing a revolution at home. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9th. Um, and the war ended with the armistice of November 11th of 1918. Um, Now, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 to 1920 imposed settlements on the defeated powers under the Treaty of Versailles. Germany lost significant territories and they were disarmed and was required to pay. Now that's particularly trolling. Um, my name is on my YouTube channel. Basically, um, now the dissolution. So now we got now, like I said, Germany lost significant territories. Um, and they were required to pay large war reparations to the Allies. Now, the dissolution of the Russian, German, Austro-Hungary, Hungarian, and the Ottoman empires, they withdrew their national boundaries and resulted in the creation of new independent states, including Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, um, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The League of Nations was established to maintain world peace, but its failure to manage instability during the interwar period contributed to the outbreak of World War II in 1939, which technically World War II did not start in 1941. Um, Now, before World War II ever started in 1941, um, the events of 1914 to 1918 were generally known as the Great War, or simply the World War. Now, in August of 1914, the magazine The Independent wrote that this is the Great War. It names itself. In October of 1914, the Canadian magazine Maclean's Similarity wrote some wars named themselves, and this is the Great War. Contemporary Europeans also referred to it as the War to End War. And it was also described as the war to end all wars due to their perception of its unparalleled scale, devastation, and loss of life. Um, Now, the first recorded use of the term First World War was in September of 1914 by German biologist and philosopher Ernest Haeckel, who stated that there was no doubt that the course and character of the feared European war will become the First World War in the full sense of this war. Um, Now, for much of the 19th century, the major European powers maintained a tenuous balance of war and power known as the Concert of Europe. After 1848, this was challenged by Britain's withdrawal into so-called splendid isolation, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, new imperialism, and the rise of Prussia under Otto von Bismarck. Victory in the 1870 to 1871 Franco-Prussian War allowed the Bismarck to consolidate a German empire post 1871. The primary aim of French policy was to avenge this defeat. But by the early 1890s, this had switched to the expansion of the French colonial empire. Um, in 1873, Bismarck negotiated the League of the Three Empires, which included Austria, Hungary, Russia, and Germany. Um, After the 1877 to 1878 Russo-Turkish War, the League was dissolved due to Austrian concerns over the expansion of Russian influence in the Balkans, um, an area that they considered to be of vital strategic interest, basically. Now, Germany and Austria-Hungary then formed the 1879 Dual Alliance, which became the Triple Alliance when it joined Italy in 1882. For Bismarck, the purpose of these agreements was to isolate France by ensuring the three empires resolved any disputes among themselves. In 1887, Bismarck set up the Reinsurance Treaty, a secret agreement between Germany and Russia to remain neutral if either were attacked by France or Austria-Hungary. Now, for Bismarck, the peace with Russia was the foundation of German foreign policy, but in 1890 he was forced to retire by Wilhelm II. The latter was persuaded not to renew the reinsurance treaty by his new chancellor, Leo von Caprivi. Now, this gave France an opening to agree to the Franco-Russian alliance in 1894, which was then followed by the 1904 Entente Cordial with Britain. The Triple Entente was completed by the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention. While they were not formal alliances by settling long-standing colonial disputes in Asia and Africa, British support for France or Russia in any future conflict became a possibility. This was accentuated by British and Russian support for France against Germany during the 1911 Agadir crisis. Now, German economic and industrial strength continued to expand rapidly post 1871, which was backed by Wilhelm II and Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, sought to use this group to build an imperial German navy that could compete with the British Royal Navy. This policy was based on the work of U.S. naval author Fred Thayer Mahan, who argued that possession of a blue water navy was vital for global power projection. Now, Tirpitz had his books translated into German. Willem made them required reading for his advisors and senior military personnel. Now, Bismarck opposed any attempt to compete with the Royal Navy since he believed Britain would not interfere in Europe as long as its maritime supremacy remained secure. Now, his dismissal in 1890 led to a change in policy and the start of the Anglo-German naval arms race. Despite the vast sums spent by Tirpitz, the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 made every existing battleship obsolete and gave the British a technological advantage that they never relinquished. Now, ultimately, Germany invested huge resources on creating a navy large enough to antagonize Britain, but not to defeat it. In 1911, Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann Hollweg acknowledged defeat, leading to the West of the armament's turning point when he switched expenditure from the Navy to the Army. Now, this decision was driven by German concerns over the speed of Russia's recovery from defeat in the Russian-Japanese War and the subsequent 1905 Russian Revolution. I never even knew that. I never even noticed that Russia and Japan ever had a war where they fought against each other. God, there's a lot of shit that nobody knows. Now, economic reforms led to significant post-1908 expansion of railways and transportation infrastructure, particularly in its western border regions. Since Germany and Austria-Hungary relied on faster mobilization to compensate for their numerical inferiority compared to Russia, the threat posed by the closing of this gap was more important than competing with the Royal Navy after Germany expanded its standing army by 170,000 troops. In 1913, France extended compulsory military service from 2 to 3 years, sparking similar measures from the Balkan powers. Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary obsolete figures are difficult to calculate due to differences in categorizing expenditure since they omit civilian infrastructure projects like railways, which had logistical importance and military use. And however, from 1908 to 1913, military spending by the 6 major European powers increased by over 50% in real terms. Now, before 1914, the years before that were marked by a series of crises in the Balkans as other powers sought to benefit from the Ottoman decline. While pan-Slavic and Orthodox Russia considered itself the protector of Serbia and other Slavic states, they preferred the strategically vital Bosporus Straits to be controlled by a weak Ottoman government rather than the ambitious Slavic power like Bulgaria. Now, Russia had ambitions in northeastern Anatolia, while its clients had overlapping claims in the Balkans. Now, these competing interests divided Russian policymakers and added to regional instability. Now, the Austrian statesmen viewed the Balkans as essential for the continued existence of their empire and saw Serbian expansion as a direct threat. The 1908-1909 Bosnian crisis began when Austria annexed the former Ottoman territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which it had occupied since 1878. Now, timed to coincidence with the Bulgarian Declaration of Independence from the Ottoman Empire, this unilateral action was denounced by the European powers, but accepted as there was no consensus on how to resolve the situation. Now, some historians see this as a significant escalation, ending any chance of Austria cooperating with Russia and the Balkans, while also damaging diplomatic relations between Serbia and Italy. Now, tensions included, and the tensions would increase after the 1911-1912 Italian-Turkish War, demonstrated Ottoman weakness, and it led to the formation of the Balkan League, an alliance of Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece. Now, the League quickly overran most of the Ottomans' territory in the Balkans during the 1912-1913 First Balkan War, much to the surprise of outside observers. The Serbian capture of ports on the Adriatic resulted in partial Australian mobilization starting on November 21st of 1912, including units along the Russian border in Galicia. The Russian government decided not to mobilize in response, and they were unprepared to precipitate a war. Now, the great powers sought to reassert control through the 1913 Treaty of London, which had created an independent Albania while enlarging the territories of Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro, and Greece. However, disputes between the victors sparked the 33-day Second Balkan War when Bulgaria attacked Serbia and Greece on June 16th of 1913. It was defeated, losing most of Macedonia to Serbia and Greece, and southern of Dobroja to Romania. The result was that even countries which benefited from the Balkan War, such as Serbia and Greece, felt cheated out of their rightful gains, while for Austria, and demonstrated the apparent indifference with which other powers viewed their concerns, including Germany. Now, this complex mix of resentment, nationalism, and insecurity helps explain why the pre-1914 Balkans became known as the powder keg of Europe. Um, and here's a picture of one of some of the people from the war. This right here, it says traditionally thought to show the arrest of Gavrilo Princip writes, this photo is now believed by historians to depict an innocent bystander from June 18th of 2014. Now, on June 18th, no, sorry, June 28th of 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, and who was the heir presumptive to Emperor I of Austria, visited Sarajevo, the capital of the recently annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, Popovic, Gavrilo Princip, Nedeljko, Tripko, Vaso, Kuber, who was a Bosnian Serbian, and Mohammed from the Bosniak community, and from that movement known as Young Bosnia, took up positions along the Archduke's motorcade route to assassinate him, and supplied with arms for extremists within the Serbian Black Hand intelligence organization. They hoped his death would free Bosnia from any Australian rule or Austrian rule. Now, Kabranovic threw a grenade into the Archduke's car and injured two of his aides. The other assassins were unsuccessful. An hour later, as Ferdinand was returning from visiting the injured officers in the hospital, his car took a wrong turn into a street where Gavrilo Princip was standing. He fired two pistol shots, fatally wounding Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, which means I think he killed them. Now, according to historian Zbigniew Zeman in Vienna, the event almost failed to make any impression whatsoever. But on June 28th and 29th, the crowds listened to music and drank wine as if nothing had ever happened. Nevertheless, the impact of the murder of the heirs to the throne was significant and has been described by historian Christopher Clark as a 9/11 effect, a terrorist event charged with historic meaning, transforming the political chemistry in Vienna. Um, now, Though the Austrian and Hungarian authorities encouraged subsequent anti-Serbian riots in Sarajevo, violent actions against ethnic Serbians were also organized outside Sarajevo and other cities in Austrian Hungarian-controlled Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, Croatia and Slovenia, Austrian Hungarian authorities in Bosnia and Herzegovina imprisoned approximately 5,500 prominent Serbians, 700 to 2,200 of whom died in prison. Since I'm not part of the LGBT community, I could care less. Um, Now, a further 4,600 Serbians were sentenced to death. A predominantly Bosniak special militia known as the um, Shoots Course was established and carried out the persecution of Serbians. Um, Now, here's a picture of the crowds during the crowds in the streets in the aftermath of the anti-Serbian riots in Sarajevo on June 29th of 1914. Then you come down here, and there's some more photos. These are cheering crowds in London and Paris on the day that war was declared. I don't know why you would be cheering a war that would be declared. The whole point is not to go to war. So the assassination initiated the July crisis, a month of diplomatic maneuvering among Austria and Hungary, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain. Um, Believing that Serbian intelligence helped organize France Fernandez's murder, Austrian officials wanted to use the opportunity to end Serbian interference in Bosnia and solve war as the best way of achieving this. Now, however, the foreign ministry had no solid proof of Serbian involvement. On July 23rd, Austria delivered an ultimatum to Serbia, listing 10 different demands that were made intentionally unacceptable to provide an excuse for starting hostilities. Um, Now, Serbia ordered general mobilization on July 25th, but accepted all the terms except for those empowering the Austrian representatives to suppress subversive elements inside Serbia and to take part in the investigation and trial of Serbians linked to the assassination. Claiming this amounted to rejection, Austria broke off diplomatic relations and ordered partial mobilization the next day. On July 28th, they declared war on Serbia and began shelling Belgrade. Russia ordered general mobilization in support of Serbia on July 30th. Um, Now anxious to ensure backing from the SPD political opposition by presenting Russia as the aggressor, German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg delayed the commencement of war preparations until July 31st. That afternoon, the Russian government were handed a note requiring them to cease all war measures against Germany and Austria-Hungary within 12 hours. Now, a further German demand for neutrality was refused by the French, who ordered general mobilization, but they delayed declaring the war. Um, I have not gotten that far, but that'll be something to research. And since I am Jewish, I could not tell you. Now, a further German demand for neutrality was refused by the French, who ordered general mobilization, but like I said, but they delayed declaring war. Now, the German general staff had long assumed that they faced a war on two fronts. The Sheepland Plan envisioned using 80% of the army to defeat France, but then switching it to Russia, since this required them to move quickly. Mobilization orders were issued that afternoon. Once the German ultimatum to Russia expired on the morning of August 1st, the two countries were at war. Um, at a meeting on July 29th, the British cabinet had narrowly decided its obligations to Belgium under the 1839 Treaty of London did not require it to oppose a German invasion with military force. But however, um, Prime Minister Asquith and his senior cabinet ministers were already committed to supporting France. The Royal Navy had been mobilized, and public opinion was strongly in favor of intervention. On July 31st, Britain sent notes to Germany and France asking them to respect Belgian neutrality. France pledged to do so, but Germany did not immediately give a reply. Um, Now, aware of the German plans to attack through Belgium, French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre asked his government for permission to cross the border and preempt such a move. To avoid violating Belgian neutrality, he was told any advance could come only after a German invasion. Um, Instead, the French cabinet ordered its army to withdraw 10 kilometers behind the German frontiers to avoid provoking war. On August 2nd, Germany occupied Luxembourg and exchanged fire with French units when German patrols entered French territory. On August 3rd, they declared war on France and demanded free passage across Belgium, which was refused. But early on the morning of August 4th, the Germans invaded, and Albert I of Belgium called for assistance under the Treaty of London. Britain sent Germany an ultimatum demanding they withdrew from Belgium. Well, when this expired at midnight, without a response, the two empires would begin war. Um, Now, Germany promised to support Austria-Hungary's invasion of Serbia, but interpretations of what this meant differed. Now, previously tested deployment plans had been replaced in early 1914, but those had never been tested in exercises. Austrian Hungary and Hungarian leaders believed that Germany would cover its northern flank against Russia. Um, but beginning on August 12th, the Austrians and Serbians clashed at the battles of the Sur and Kalubera. Over the next 2 weeks, Austrian attacks were repulsed with heavy losses. Now, as a result of this, Austria had to keep sizable forces on the Serbian front, weakening their efforts against Russia. Now, Serbia's victory against Austria-Hungary in the 1914 invasion has been called one of the major upset victories of the 20th century. In 1915, the campaign saw the first use of an anti-aircraft warfare after an Austrian plane was shot down with ground to airfare, as well as the first medical excavation by the Serbian army. Now, at the top here, you see the Serbian army. At the top here, and then go to the bottom, and you see the German soldiers on the way to the front in 1914, and they're on a train. Yeah. Subject today is World War One. Now, upon mobilization in accordance with the Schlieffen Plan, 80% of the German army was located on the Western Front, with the remainder acting as a screening force in the east. Rather than a direct attack across the shared frontier, the German right wing would sweep through the Netherlands and Belgium, and then they would swing south, encircling Paris and trapping the French army against the Swiss border. The plan's creator, Alfred von Schlieffen, head of the German General Staff from 1891 to 1906, estimated that this would take 6 weeks, after which the German army would transfer to the east and defeat the Russians. At least that's what their plan was. Okay, get that back up here. So the plan was substantially modified by his successor, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger. Under Schlieffen, 85% of the German forces in the west were assigned to the right wing, with the remainder holding along the frontier. By keeping his left wing deliberately weak, he hoped to lure the French into an offensive into the lost provinces of Alsace-Lorraine, which was a strategy envisioned by their plan. 17. However, Moltke grew concerned that the French might push too hard on his left flank as the German army increased the size from 1908 to 1914. He changed the allocation of forces between the two wings to 70-30. He also considered Dutch neutrality essential for German trade and canceled the incursion into the Netherlands, which meant any delays in Belgium threatened the viability of the plan. Historian Richard Holmes argues that these changes meant the right wing was not strong enough to achieve any decisive success. And here is the French bayonet charge. Picture of the French bayonet charge, which was during the Battle of the Frontiers by the end of August. French casualties exceeded 260,000, including 75,000 that were dead. Now, the initial German advance in the west was very successful. By August, the Allied left, which included the British Expeditionary Force, known as the BEF, was in full retreat, and the French offensive in Alsace-Lorraine was a disastrous failure, with casualties exceeding 260,000. German planning provided broad strategic instructions while allowing army commanders considerable freedom and carrying them out to the front. by Alexander von Kluck, used the Straits to display orders, opening the gap between the German armies as they closed on Paris. The French army, reinforced by the British Expeditionary Corps, um, seized the opportunity to counterattack, and they pushed the German army 40 to 80 kilometers back. Now, both armies were then so exhausted that no decisive move could be implemented, so they settled in trenches with the vain hope of breaking through as soon as they could build local superiority. Um, Now, in 1911, the Russian Stavka agreed with the French to attack Germany within 15 days of mobilization, 10 days before the Germans had anticipated. Although it meant the two Russian armies that entered East Prussia on August 17th did so without many of their support elements. Um, by the end of 1914, German troops held strong defensive positions inside France, and that controlled the bulk of France's domestic coal fields, and it inflicted 230,000 more casualties than it lost itself. Um, however, communication problems and questionable command decisions cost Germany the chance of a decisive outcome while it had failed to achieve the primary objective of avoiding a long two-front war. And as was apparent to several German soldiers, this amounted to a strategic defeat. And shortly after the First Battle of the Marne, Crown Prince Wilhelm told an American reporter that we have lost the war. It will go on for a long time, but it's lost already. And then here, you got Japanese soldiers hiding in Japanese soldiers. Okay, so right here, the top picture right here is Japanese soldiers occupying a captured German trench during the siege of Singto in 1914. And then down here, there's another photo, and this is the British artillery in Cameroon in 1915. Yeah, pretty interesting for these wars. Now, on August 30th of 1914, New Zealand occupied German Samoa, which is just called Samoa now. On September 11th, the Austrian naval and military expeditionary force landed on the island of New Britain, which was then part of German New Guinea. On October 28th, the German cruiser SMS Emden sank the Russian cruiser Zemchug in the Battle of Penang. Now, Japan declared war on Germany before seizing territories in the Pacific, which later became the South Seas Mandate, as well as German treaty ports on the Chinese Shandong Peninsula at Tsingtao. Now, after Vienna refused to withdraw its cruiser SMS Kaiserin Elizabeth from Tsingtao, Japan declared war on Austria-Hungary, and the ship was scuttled in November of 1914. Within a few months, Allied forces had seized all German territories in the Pacific, leaving only isolated commerce raiders and a few holdouts in New Guinea. Now, some of the first clashes of the war involved British, French, and German colonial forces in Africa. Between August 6th and 7th of that year, French and British troops invaded the German proctorates of Togoland and Cameroon. On August 10th, German forces in Southwest Africa attacked South Africa. Sporadic and fierce fighting continued for the rest of that war. The German colonial forces in German East Africa, led by Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, had fought a guerrilla warfare campaign and only surrendered 2 weeks after the armistice took effect in Europe. Here's the British Indian Army. You can see this here. This is British Indian Army infantry divisions of France, and these troops were withdrawn in December of 1915, and they served in the Mesopotamian campaign. Now, before the war, Germany had attempted to use Indian nationalism and pan-Islamic to its advantage, a policy that continued post 1914 by instigating uprisings in India. while the Niedermeyer handshake expedition urged Afghanistan to join the war on the side of Central Powers. However, contrary to British fears of a revolt in India, the outbreak of the war saw a reduction in nationalist activity. Leaders leaders from the Indian National Congress and other groups relayed support for the British war effort would hasten the Indian Home Rule, a promise allegedly made explicit in 1917 by Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India. Um, Now, in 1914, the British Indian Army was larger than the British Army itself, and between 1914 and 1918, an estimated 1.3 million Indian scholars and laborers served in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And all in all, 140,000 soldiers served on the Western Front and nearly 700,000 in the Middle East, with 47,746 killed and 65,126 were wounded. The suffering engendered by the war, as well as the failure of the British government to grant itself government to India afterward, had bred disillusionment, resulting in the campaign for full independence led by Mahatma Gandhi. Um, Now here's a picture of the British Indian soldiers digging trenches. That's where they would hide at. Um, that was also where they would take cover. Um, now, pre-war military tactics that had emphasized open warfare and individual riflemen proved obsolete when confronted with conditions prevailing in 1914. Now, technological advances allowed the creation of a strong defensive system, largely impervious to mass infantry advances such as barbed wire, machine guns, and above all, far more powerful artillery. Um, Now, which dominated the battlefield and made crossing open ground extremely difficult. Now, both sides struggled to develop tactics for breaching entrenched positions without any heavy casualties. In time, technology enabled the production of new offensive weapons such as gas warfare and the tank. Um, Now, after the First Battle of the Marne in September of 1914, Allied and German forces unsuccessfully tried to outflank each other, a series of the maneuvers later known as the Race to the Sea. By the end of 1914, the opposing forces confronted each other along an uninterpreted line of entrenched positions from the Channel to the Swiss border. Since the Germans were normally able to choose where to stand, they generally held up the high ground, while their trenches tended to be better built. Those constructed by the French and English were initially considered temporary and were only needed until an offensive would destroy the German defenses. Um, Now, both sides tried to break the stalemates using scientific and technological advances. On July 22nd of April of 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans violated the Hague Convention, used chlorine gas for the first time on the Western Front. Several types of gas soon became widely used on both sides, and though it never proved a decisive battle-winning weapon, it became one of the most feared and best remembered horrors of the war. Uh, I think that's something that Hitler had used during World War II, but I'm not sure. Um, Now, in February of 1916, the Germans attacked French defensive positions at the Battle of Verdun, lasting until December of 1916. Casualties were greater for the French, but the Germans bled heavily as well, with anywhere from 700,000 to 925,000 casualties between the two combatants. Verdun became a symbol of French determination and self-sacrifice. Now, the Battle of the Somme was an Anglo-French offensive from July to November of 1916. The opening day on July 1st, 1916, was the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army, which suffered 57,000 casualties, including 19,200 dead. Um, as a whole, the Somme offensive led to an estimated 420,000 British casualties, along with 200,000 French and 500,000 Germans. Now, the diseases that emerged in the trenches were a major killer on both sides. The living conditions led to disease and infections such as trench foot, lice, typhus fever, trench fever, and the Spanish flu. Um, Now, at the start of the war, German cruisers were scattered across the globe, and some of which were subsequently used to attack the Allied merchant shipping. And these were systematically hunted down by the Royal Navy, though not before causing considerable damage. Now, one of the most successful was the SMS Emden, which was part of the German East Asia Squadron stationed at Qingdao, which seized or sank 15 merchantmen ships, a Russian cruiser, and a French destroyer. Most of the squadron was returning to Germany when it sank two British armored cruisers at the Battle of Coronel in November of 1914, before being virtually destroyed in the Battle of the Falkland Islands in December. Now, the SMS Dresden escaped with a few auxiliaries, but after the Battle of Massa Chira, these two were either destroyed or they were interned. Um, Now, soon after the outbreak of hostilities, Britain began a naval blockade of Germany, and this proved effective in cutting off vital supplies. Though it violated accepted international law, Britain also mined international waters, which closed off entire sections of the ocean, even to neutral ships. And since there was a limited response to this tactic, Germany expected a similar response to its unrestricted submarine warfare. The Battle of Jutland, in between May and June of 1916, was the only full-scale clash of battleships during the war, and one of the largest in history. The clash was indecisive, though the Germans inflicted more damage than they received. Thereafter, the bulk of the German high seas fleet was confined to ports. Um, Now, German U-boats attempted to cut the supply lines between North America and Britain, and the nature of submarine warfare meant that attacks often came without warning, giving the crews of the merchant ships little hope of survival. The United States launched a protest, and Germany changed its rules of engagement. After the sinking of the passenger ship RMS Lusitania in 1915, Germany promised not to target passenger liners, while Britain armed its merchant ships, placing them beyond the protection of the cruiser rules, which demanded warning and movement of the crews to a place of safety, a standard that lifeboats did not meet. Finally, in early 1917, Germany adopted a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, realizing that the Americans would eventually enter the war, and Germany sought to strangle Allied sea lanes before the United States could transport a large army overseas. But after initial success, they eventually failed to do so. Um, Now, the U-boat threats lessened in 1917 when merchant ships began traveling in convoys escorted by destroyers. This tactic made it difficult for U-boats to find targets, which significantly lessened the losses after the hydrophone and depth changes were introduced. Destroyers could potentially successfully attack a submerged submarine, and convoys slowed the flow of supplies since ships had to wait as convoys were assembled. Um, the solution was an extensive program of building new freighters. The troop ships were too fast for the submarines, and they did not trouble the North Atlantic in convoys. The U-boats sunk more than 5,000 Allied ships at the cost of 199 submarines. Um, Now, World War One also saw the first use of aircraft carriers in combat, with HMS Furious launching Sopwith Camels in a successful raid against the Zeppelin hangars at Tondern in July of 1918, as well as blimps for the anti-submarine patrol. So here's two more pictures. The top picture, the top picture here is a refugee transport from Serbia to Syria in 1914, and down here is Bulgarian soldiers, and the bottom picture is Bulgarian soldiers in a trench preparing to fire against an oncoming aeroplane. Um, Now, faced with Russia in the east and Austria-Hungary could spur only one-third of its army to attack Serbia, after suffering heavy losses, the Australians briefly occupied the Serbian capital, Belgrade. A Serbian counterattack in the Battle of Kolubara succeeded in driving them from the country by the end of 1914, but in the first 10 months of 1915, Austria-Hungary used most of its military reserves to fight Italy. German and Austrian-Hungary diplomats scored a coup by persuading Bulgaria to join the attack on Serbia. Um, the Austrian-Hungarian provinces of Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia provided troops for Austria-Hungary, and Montenegro allied itself with Serbia. Now, Bulgaria had declared war on Serbia on October 14th of 1915, and joined in the attack by the Austrian-Hungarian army under Mackensen's army of 250,000 that was already underway. Now, Serbia was conquered in little more than a month as the Central Powers, now including Bulgaria, sent in 600,000 troops in total. The Serbian army, fighting on two fronts and facing certain defeats, retreated into northern Albania. The Serbians suffered defeats in the Battle of Kosovo. Montenegro covered the Serbian retreat toward the Adriatic coast in the Battle of Majdakovac on January 6th and 7th of 1916. But ultimately, the Australians also conquered, like I said, Montenegro. The surviving Serbian soldiers were evacuated to Greece, but after the conquest, Serbia was divided between Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria. Now, in 1915, the Franco-British force landed at Salonika in Greece to offer assistance and to pressure its government to declare war against the Central Powers. Now, however, the pro-German King Constans I dismissed the pro-Allied government of Eleftherios Venizelos before the Allied expeditionary force arrived. Now, the Macedonian front was at first mostly static, but French and Serbian forces retook limited areas of Macedonia by recapturing Bitola on November 19th of 1916, following the costly Monastir offensive, which brought stabilization of the front. Now, here's a picture of the Austrian-Hungarian troops executing Serbians in 1917, and Serbia lost about 850,000 people during that war, a quarter of its pre-war population. Now, Serbian and French troops finally made a breakthrough in September of 1918 in the Vardar offense. After most German and Austrian-Hungarian troops had been withdrawn, the Bulgarians were defeated at the Battle of Dobro Pole, and by September 25th, British and French troops had crossed the border into Bulgaria. Bulgaria proper as the Bulgarian army collapsed. Bulgaria capitulated for 4 days later on September 29th of 1918. The German High Command responded by dispatching troops to hold that line, but these forces were too weak to reestablish any front. The Allied breakthrough on the Macedonian front cut communications between the Ottoman Empire and the other Central Powers. Now, and that made Vienna vulnerable to any attack. Now, Hindenburg and Ludendorff concluded that the strategic and operational balance had now shifted decidedly against the Central Powers, and a day after the Bulgarian collapse, it insisted on an immediate peace settlement. Now, the Ottoman Empire threatened Russia's Caucasian territories and Britain's communications with India via the Suez Channel. The Suez Canal, basically, the Ottoman Empire took advantage of the European powers' preoccupation with the war, and they conducted the large-scale ethnic cleansing of the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian Christian populations. The Armenian genocide, Greek genocide, and Assyrian genocide, respectively. Now, the British and French opened overseas fronts with the Gallipoli and the Mesopotamian campaigns in 1914 and 1915, respectively. Now, Gallipoli, the Ottoman Empire successfully repelled the British, French, and Australian and New Zealand army corps known as the Anzacs. In Mesopotamia, by contrast with the defeat of the British defenders in the siege of Kutch by the empires 1915 to 1916, British imperial forces reorganized and captured Baghdad in March of 1917. The British were aided in Mesopotamia by local Arab and Assyrian fighters, while the Ottomans employed local Kurdish and Turkoman tribes. The Suez Canal was defended from Ottoman attacks in 1915 and 1916, but in August of 1916 itself, a German and Ottoman force was defeated at the Battle of Romani by the Anzac Mounted Division and the 52nd Lowland Infantry Division. Now, following this victory, an Egyptian expeditionary force advanced across the Sinai Peninsula pushing Ottoman forces back in the Battle of Maghaba in December, and the Battle of Rafah on the border between the Egyptian Sinai and the Ottoman Palestine in January of 1917. Um, Now, Russian armies generally had success in the Caucasus campaign. Now Enver Pasha, supreme commander of the Ottoman armed forces, dreamed of reconquering Central Asia and areas that had been previously lost to Russia. He, however, was a poor commander and could not command anybody really well. He launched an offensive against the Russians in the Caucasus in December 1914 with only 100,000 troops, insisting on a frontal attack against mountainous Russian positions in winter. He would lose 86% of his force at the Battle of Sarikamish and General Nikolai Yudenich, the Russian commander from 1915 to 1916, drove the Turks out of most of the southern Caucasus. Um, Now, the Ottoman Empire, with German support, invaded Persia, which is now mostly modern day Iran, in December of 1914 to cut off British and Russian access to petroleum reservoirs around Baku. Now, Persia, also ultimately neutral, had long been under British and Russian influence. Um, Now, the Ottomans and Germans were aided by Kurdish and Azeri forces, and together with a large number of major Iranian tribes, while the Russians and British had the support of Armenian and Assyrian forces, the Persian campaign lasted until 1918 and ended in failure for the Ottomans and their allies. However, the Russian withdrawal from the war in 1917 led Armenian and Assyrian forces to be cut off on supply lines, outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated, um, and forcing them to fight and flee towards British lines in northern Mesopotamia. Now, the Arab revolt, instigated by the British Foreign Office, started in June of 1916 with the Battle of Mecca. Led Sharif Hussein, the Sharif declared the independence of the Kingdom of Hajjaj, and with the British assistance, conquered much of the Ottoman-held Arabia. Excuse me, and the resulting finally in the Ottoman surrender of Damascus. Fakhri Pasha, the Ottoman commander of Medina, resisted for more than 2.5 years during the siege of Medina before surrendering in January of 1919. The Senussi tribe along the border of the Italian Libya and British Egypt fronts, incited and armed by the Turks, waged a small-scale guerrilla war against Allied troops, and the British were forced to dispatch 12,000 troops to oppose them in the Senussi campaign, and the rebellion was finally crushed in mid 1916. Um, um, Now, the total Allied casualties on the Ottoman front amounted to 650,000 men. Total Ottoman casualties were 725,000, but 325,000 dead and 400,000 wounded. Um, Now, even though Italy joined the Triple Alliance in 1882, a treaty with its traditional Austrian enemy was so controversial that subsequent governments denied its existence, and the terms were only made public in 1915 after 33 years. Now this Now this arose from the nationalist designs on the Hungarian territory in Trentino, the Austrian littoral, Rijeka, and the Dalmatia, considered vital to secure the borders established in 1866. Um, in 1902, Rome secretly had agreed with France to remain neutral if the latter was attacked by Germany, effectively nullifying its role in the Triple Alliance. Um, Now, when World War I began in 1914, Italy argued that Triple Alliance was defensive and it was not obligated to support an Australian attack on Serbia. Opposition to joining the Central Powers increased when Turkey became a member in secret, or in September, basically. And since in 1911, Italy had occupied Ottoman possessions in Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. No, to secure Italian neutrality, the Central Powers offered them Tunisia, while in return for an immediate entry into the war, the Allies agreed to their demands for Austrian territory and sovereignty other than Dodecanese, although they remained secret, and these provisions were incorporated into the April 1915 Treaty of London, and Italy joined the Allies on July 23rd. May 23rd. Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary and on Germany 15 months later. Um, Now, the pre 1914 Italian army was short of officers, trained men, adequate transport, and modern weapons. But April of 1915, some of these deficiencies had been remedied, but it was still unprepared for the major offensive required by the Treaty of London. The advantage of superior numbers were offset by the difficult terrain. Much of the fighting took place high in the Alps and the Dolomites, where the trench lines had to be cut through rock and ice, and keeping troops supplied was a major challenge. Um, Now, these issues were exacerbated by unimaginative strategies and tactics. Between 1915 and 1917, the Italian commander Luigi Cardona undertook a series of frontal assaults along the Isonzo, which made little progress and cost many lives. By the end of the war, Italian combat deaths totaled around 540,000. In the spring of 1916, the Austrian-Hungarian counterattacked in Asiago, and the Strap expedition, but made little progress, and they were pushed by the Italians back to Tyrol. Although Italy occupied southern Albania in May of 1916, the main focus was the Iceno front, which, after the capture of Gorizia in August of 1916, remained static until October of 1917. After a combined Austro-German force won a major victory at Caporetto, Cardona was replaced by Armando Diaz, who retreated more than 100 kilometers before holding the positions along the Piave River. Now, a second Austrian offensive was repulsed in June of 1918. On October 24th, Diaz launched the Battle of Vitriol on Veneto, and initially met stubborn resistance, but with Austria-Hungary collapsing, Hungarian divisions in Italy demanded they be sent home. When this was granted, many others followed, and the Imperial Army disintegrated. The Italians taken over 300,000 prisoners. On November 3rd, the armistice of Villa Giusti ended hostilities between Austria and Hungary and Italy, which occupied Trieste and areas along the Adriatic Sea, awarded to it in 1915. As previously agreed with French President Raymond Poincaré, Russian plans at the start of the war were to simultaneously advance into the Austrian Galicia and East Prussia as soon as possible. Although their attack on Galicia was largely successful, and the invasion achieved their aim of forcing Germany to divert troops from the Western Front, the speed of mobilization meant that they did so without much of their heavy equipment and support functions. Um, these weaknesses contributed to Russia's defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in August and September of 1914, and it forced them to withdraw from East Prussia with heavy losses. By spring of 1915, they also had retreated from Galicia, and the May 1915 Gorlice Tarnow offensive allowed the Central Powers to invade Russian occupied Poland. Um, Now, despite the successful June 1916 Brusilov offensive against the Austrians in eastern Galicia, shortages of supplies, heavy losses, and command failures prevented the Russians from fully exploiting their victory. However, it is one of the most significant offensives of the war, diverting German resources from Verdun, relieving Austro-Hungarian pressure on the Italians, and convincing Romania to enter the war on the side of the Allies on August 27th. Now, it also fatally weakened both the Austrian and Russian armies, whose offensive capabilities were badly affected by their losses, and increased disillusion with the war that ultimately led to the Russian Revolution. Um, Now, meanwhile, unrest grew in Russia as Tsar Nicholas II remained at the front, with the home front controlled by Empress Alexandra. Her increasingly competent role in food shortages in urban areas led to widespread protests and the murder of her favorite, Grigory Rasputin, at the end of 1916. Um, Now, despite them secretly agreeing to support the Triple Alliance in 1883, Romania increasingly found itself at odds with the Central Powers over the support for Bulgaria in the Balkan War, and the status of the Afghan community controlled Transylvania is known as something else. I forget what Transylvania is known as now. It's not called that anymore. Which compromised an estimated 8 million of the region's 5.0 million population. With the ruling elites split into the pro-German and pro-Entente factions, Romania remained neutral for 2 years while allowing Germany and Austria to transport military supplies and advisors across Romanian territory. Um, Now, in September of 1914, Russia acknowledged Romanian rights to Austrian-Hungarian territories, including Transylvania and Banat, whose acquisition had widespread popular support. Um, and Russian success against Austria led Romania to join the Entente in the August 1916 Treaty of Bucharest. Under the strategic plan known as Hypothesis Z, the Romanian army planned offensive into Transylvania while defending southern Dobruja and Georgia against a possible Bulgarian counterattack. On August 27th of 1916, they attacked Transylvania and occupied substantial parts of the province before being driven back by the recently formed German Ninth Army, led by the former Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn. A combined German-Bulgarian-Turkish offensive captured Dobruja and Georgia, although the bulk of the Romanian army managed to escape encirclement, and they retreated to Bucharest, which surrendered to the Central Powers on December 6th of 1916. Now, in the summer of 1917, a Central Powers offensive began in Romania under the command of August von Mackensen to knock Romania out of the war, resulting in the battles of Oitiz, Marasti, and Maraseti. And Maraseti were up to 1 million Central Power troops were present. The battles were lasted from July 22nd to September 3rd, and eventually the Romanian army was victorious, advancing 500 kilometers. August von Mackensen could not plan for another offensive as he had to transfer troops to the Italian front line. Following the Russian Revolution, Romania found itself alone on the eastern front, and they signed the Treaty of Bucharest with the Central Powers, which recognized Romanian sovereignty over Bessarabia, in return for ceding control of passes in the Carpathian Mountains to Austria-Hungary. And leasing its oil wells to Germany, although approved by Parliament. King Ferdinand I refused to sign it, hoping for an Allied victory in the West. Romania re-entered the war in November of 1918 on the side of the Allies, and the Treaty of Bucharest was permanently annulled by the armistice on November 11th of 1918. Now, on December 12th of 1916, after 10 brutal months of the Battle of Verdun and a successful offensive against Romania, Germany attempted to negotiate a peace with the Allies. However, this attempt was rejected out of hand as a duplicitous war ruse. U.S. President the then U.S. President Woodrow Wilson attempted to intervene as a peacemaker, asking for both sides to state their demands. Lloyd George's War Cabinet considered the German offer to be a ploy to create divisions among the Allies. After initial outrage and much deliberation, they took Wilson's note as a separate effort, signaling that the U.S. was on the verge of entering the war against Germany. Following the submarine outrages, and while the Allies debated a response to Wilson's offer, the Germans chose to rebuff it in favor of a direct exchange of views. Learning of the German response, the Allied governments were free to make clear demands in the response of January 14th. They sought restoration of damages, the evacuation of occupied territories, reparations for France, Russia, and Romania, and the recognition of the principle of nationalities. The Allies sought guarantees that would prevent or limit future wars. Now the negotiations failed, and the Entente powers rejected the German offer on the grounds of honor, and they knew that Germany had not put forward any specific proposals. So by the end of the 1916, Russia casualties totaled nearly 5 million killed, and they were wounded or captured. Now, with the major urban areas affected by food shortages and high prices in March of 1917, Tsar Nicholas ordered the military to forcibly suppress strikes in Petrograd, but the troops refused to fire on the crowds. Revolutionaries set up the Petrograd Soviet and feared a left-wing takeover. The State Duma forced Nicholas to abdicate and establish the Russian province the provisional government, which confirmed Russia's willingness to continue that war. However, the Petrograd Soviet refused to disband, creating competing power centers and causing confusion and chaos, with frontline soldiers becoming increasingly demoralized. Um, um, Following the Tsar's abdication, Vladimir Lenin, with the help of the German government, was ushered from Switzerland to Russia on April 16th of 1917. Discontent and the weaknesses of the provisional government led to a rise in the popularity of the Bolshevik Party that was led by Vladimir Lenin, which demanded an immediate end to the war. The Revolution of November was followed in December by an armistice and negotiations with Germany. At first, the Bolsheviks refused the German terms, but when German troops began marching across Ukraine unopposed, they acceded to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk on March 3rd of 1918. The treaty ceded vast territories, including Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and parts of Poland and Ukraine, to the Central Powers. Um, um, oh shit! Kind of stretch here. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Yeah, so with the Russian Empire out of the war, Romania found itself alone in the Eastern Front, and they signed the Treaty of Bucharest with the Central Powers in May of 1918. But under the terms of that treaty, Romania had to give up territory to Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria, and they leased its oil reserves to Germany. Moreover, the terms were also included in Central Powers on recognition of the Union of Bessarabia with Romania. Um, Now, the United States was a major supplier of war materials to the Allies, but they remained neutral in 1914, in large part due to domestic opposition. Um, Now, the most significant factor in creating the support Wilson needed was the German submarine offensive, which not only cost American lives but paralyzed trade, as ships were reluctant to be put to sea. On April 6th of 1917, Congress declared war on Germany as an associated power of the Allies. The U.S. Navy sent a battleship group to Scapa Flow to join the Grand Fleet and provided convoy escorts. In April of 1917, the U.S. Army had fewer than 300,000 men, including National Guard units, compared to British and French armies of 4.1 and up to 8.3 million, respectively. The Selective Service Act of 1917 drafted over 2.8 million men, though training and equipping such numbers was a huge logistical challenge. By June of 1918, over 667,000 members of the American Expeditionary Force were transported into France, a figure which reached 2 million by the end of November. Despite his conviction that Germany must be defeated, Woodrow Wilson went to war to ensure the U.S. played a leading role in shaping that peace, which meant preserving the AEF as a separate military force rather than being absorbed into British or French units as his allies wanted. He was strongly supportive. He was strongly supported by AEF Commander General John J. Pershing, a proponent of the pre-1914 open warfare, who considered the French and British emphasis on artillery misguided and compatible with the American offensive spirit. Much to the frustration of his allies, who had suffered heavy losses in 1917, he insisted on retaining control of American troops and refused to commit them to the front line until able to operate as independent units. Now, as a result, the first significant U.S. involvement was the Meuse-Argonne offensive in late September of 1918. Um, Okay, in December of 1916, Robert Nivelle replaced Pétain as the commander of the French armies on the Western Front, and they began planning a spring attack in Champagne, part of a joint Franco-British operation. Poor security meant German intelligence was well informed on tactics and timetables. Despite this, when the attack began on April 16th, the French made substantial gains, but before being brought to a halt by the newly built and extremely strong defenses on the Hindenburg Line, the Nivelle persisted with frontal assaults, and by April 25th, the French had suffered nearly 135,000 casualties, including 30,000 dead, and mostly incurred in the first 2 days. Um, 2 days. 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 excuse me. So concurrent British attacks at Arras was more successful, though ultimately of little strategic value. Operating as a separate unit for the first time, the Canadian Corps capture of Vimy Ridge is viewed by many Canadians as a defining moment in creating a sense of national identity. Although the Bell continued the offensive on May 3rd, the 21st Division, which had been involved in some of the heaviest fighting at Verdun, had refused orders to go into battle, initiating the French army mutinies within days. Um, Collective and discipline had spread to about 54 divisions, while over 20,000 deserted. Um, in March and April of 1917, at the first and second battles of Gaza, German and Ottoman forces stopped the advance of the Egyptian expeditionary force, which had begun in August of 1916 at the Battle of the Romani. At the end of October of 1917, the Sinai and the Palestine campaign had resumed when General Edmund Allenby's corps um, um, Corps and the Desert Mounted Corps won the Battle of Beersheba. Two Ottoman armies were defeated a few weeks later at the Battle of Mughar Ridge. In early December, Jerusalem had been captured following another Ottoman defeat at the Battle of Jerusalem. Um, Now, at about this time, the Friedrich Freer Crest von Krestenstein was relieved of his duties as the Eighth Army's commander, replaced by and he was replaced by Pasha. And a few months later, the commander of the Ottoman army in Palestine, Erich von Falkenhayn, was replaced by the Otto Lehman von Sanders. In early 1918, the front line was extended and the Jordan Valley was occupied following the first Transjordan and the second Transjordan attacks by British Empire forces in March and April of 1918. Um, okay. So in December of 1917, the Central Powers signed an armistice with Russia, thus freeing large numbers of German troops for use in the West. With German reinforcements and new American troops pouring in, the outcome was to be decided on the Western Front. The Central Powers knew that they could not win a protracted war, but they had held high hopes for success in a final quick offensive. Ludendorff drew up plans Operation Michael for the 1918 offensive on the Western Front. The operation that commenced on March 21st, 1918, with an attack on the British forces near St. Quentin. German German forces achieved an unprecedented advantage of 60 kilometers. The initial offensive was a success after heavy fighting. However, the offensive was halted, lacking tanks or motorized artillery. The Germans were unable to consolidate any gains. Um, Now, the problems of resupply were also exacerbated by increasing distance that now stretched over terrain that was shell torn and often impassable to traffic. Germany launched an Operation Georgette against the northern English Channel ports. Um, the Allies halted the drive after limited territorial gains by Germany. The German army to the south then conducted operations Blucher and York. Um, Pushing broadly towards Paris, Germany launched Operation Marne, Second Battle of the Marne, on July 15th in an attempt to encircle Reims. The resulting counterattack, which started the Hundred Days Offensive on August 8th, led to a marked collapse in German morale. Um, um, Try this here for a minute. Not what I was looking for. I want a little bit too far down. Go down here. Okay. Okay, so by September, the Germans had fallen back to the Hindenburg Line, but the Allies had advanced to the Hindenburg Line in the north and center. German forces launched numerous counterattacks, but the positions had outposts of the line continued failing, with the BEF alone taking 30,441 prisoners in the last week of September. But on September 24th, the Supreme Army Command informed the leaders in Berlin that armistice talks were inevitable. Um, the final assault on the Hindenburg Line began with the Meuse-Argonne offensive that was launched by the American and French troops on September 26th. And 2 days later, the Belgians, French, and British attacked around Ypres. And the day after, the British at St. Quentin in the center of the line. The following week, cooperating Americans and French units broke through in Champagne at the Battle of Blanc Mountain Ridge between October 3rd and October 27th, forcing the Germans of the commanding heights and closing towards the Belgian frontier. On October 8th, the Hindenburg Line was pierced by British and Dominion troops of the First and the Third British Armies at the Second Battle of Cambrai. Now, the Allied forces started the Vardar offensive on September 15th at two key points, Dobro Pole and near Dozhren Lake. Now, in the Battle of Dobro Pole, the Serbian and French armies had success after a 3-day-long battle with relatively small casualties. And subsequently, they made a breakthrough in the front, something which was rarely seen in World War One after the front was ever broken. Allied forces started to liberate Serbia and Skopje at September 29th, after which Bulgaria signed an armistice with the Allies on September 30th. Now, the collapse of the Central Powers came swiftly. Bulgaria was the first to sign an armistice, the Armistice of Salonika, on September 29th of 1918. Wilhelm II, in a telegram to the Tsar, Ferdinand I of Bulgaria, described the situation thus: disgraceful. 62,000 Serbians decided to go to war. On the same day, the German Supreme Army Command informed Wilhelm II and the Imperial Chancellor Count George von Hertling that the military situation facing Germany was hopeless. Um, Now, on October 24th, the Italians began a push that rapidly recovered territory lost after the Battle of Caporetto. This culminated in the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, marking the end of the Austrian-Hungarian army as an effective fighting force. The offensive also triggered the disintegration of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. During the last week of October, declarations of independence were made in Budapest, Prague, and Zagreb. Um, On October 29th, the imperial authorities asked Italy for an armistice, but the Italians continued advancing, reaching Trento, Udine, and Trieste. Now, on November 3rd, Austria-Hungary sent a flag of truce, and they accepted the armistice of Villa Giusti, and they arranged with the Allied authorities in Paris, Austria, and Hungary signed separate armistice following the overthrow of the Habsburg monarchy. Now, in the following days, the Italian army occupied Innsbruck and all Tyrol with just only 20,000 soldiers. On October 30th, the Ottoman Empire capitulated and signed the armistice of Mudros. Um, Now, with the military faltering and with the widespread loss of confidence in the Kaiser, Germany moved towards surrender, and Prince Maximilian of Baden took charge on October 3rd as Chancellor of Germany. But negotiations with the then President Woodrow Wilson began immediately in the hope that he would offer better terms than the British and the French. Now, Wilson demanded a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary control over the German military. Um, Now, the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919 began at the end of October of 1918. Now, units of the German Navy refused to set sail for a large-scale operation in a war when they believed to be good as lost. Um, the sailors' revolt, which then ensued in the naval ports of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, spread across the whole country within days, and that led to the proclamation of a republic November 9th of 1918, shortly thereafter to the abdication of William II and the German surrender. In the aftermath of the war, the German, Austrian, Hungary, Ottoman, and Russian empires disappeared, but numerous nations regained their former independence and new ones were created. Four dynasties fell as a result of the war: the Romanos, the Hohenzollerns, the Habsburg, and the Ottoman Empire. Belgium and Serbia were badly damaged, as was France, with 1.4 million soldiers dead, and not counting other casualties. Germany and Russia were similarly affected. Um, now, a formal state of war between the two sides, between the two sides persisted over another 7 months until the signing of the Treaty of Versailles with Germany on June 28th of 1919. The U.S. Senate did not ratify the treaty despite public support for it, and they did not formally end its involvement in the war until the Knox Quarter Resolution was signed on July 2nd of 1921 by President Warren G. Harding. For the British Empire, the state of the war ceased under the provisions of the termination of the President War Demolition Act of 1918 concerning Germany on January 10th of 1920, Austria on July 16th of 1920, Bulgaria on August 9th of 1920, Hungary on July 26th of 1921, and Turkey on August 6th of 1924. Some war memorials date the end of the war as being when the Versailles Treaty was signed in 1919, which was when many of the troops serving abroad finally returned home. By contrast, most commemorations of the wars and concentrate on the armistice of November 11th of 1918. Um, Now, the Paris Peace Conference imposed a series of peace treaties on the Central Powers of officially ending the war. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles dealt with Germany and building on Wilson's 14th point. They established the League of Nations on June 28th of 1919. Um, Now, the Central Powers had to acknowledge responsibility for all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments in their nations and their nationals had been subjected to as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by their aggression. In the Treaty of Versailles, the statement was Article 231. This article was known as the War Guilt Clause, as the majority of Germans felt humiliated and resentful. Um, the Germans felt that they had been unjustly dealt with by what they called the dictat of Versailles. German historian Hagen Schulz said that the treaty placed Germany under legal sanctions and deprived of military power, economically ruined and politically humiliated. Belgian historian Lawrence White Purcelli emphasizes the central role played by a memory of the war and the Versailles Treaty in the German politics in the 1920s and 1930s. Um, 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 Now, the act of denial of war guilt in Germany and German resentment at both reparations and continued Allied occupations of Rhineland made widespread revision of the meaning and memory of the war problematic. The legend of the stab in the back and the wish to revise the Versailles Diktat and the belief in that international threats aimed at the elimination of the German nation persisted at the heart of German politics. Um, Even a man of peace such as the Gustav of Stresemann publicly rejected German guilt as from the Nazis. They waved the banners of domestic treason and international conspiracy in an attempt to galvanize the German nation into a spirit of revenge. Like a fascist Italy, Nazi Germany sought to redirect the memory of the war to the benefit of its policies. Um, I'm gonna leave off right there and continue this video next week for a part two. Um, but if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rusty the King. If you want more videos like this, just let me know and tell me what videos you want me to do. Leave a comment and like on the channel, and also make sure to subscribe if you like the channel. Next week it's going to be kind of harder for me to figure out a day for my videos because next Monday I start college at 11 in the morning and it goes to 3:30. But also Saturday of next week I start my vacation from my job where I'll be out for 8 days. Like I said, I'm gonna try to hit up the city of Chicago because that's close to where I live at. So basically, we'll try to hit up some museums, maybe the zoo, just to have some entertainment fun, stuff like that. And I hope you enjoyed. I'll be back sometime in the next week or two for another video of this.